Tensions between the US, Russia, Iran, China were already bad before the start of the coronavirus pandemic, and now there's all the more reason for everything to get a lot worse. The UN says we're facing a famine of biblical proportions. Russia has just suspended exports of wheat, and Donald Trump has just tweeted, "I have instructed the United States Navy to shoot down and destroy any and all Iranian gunboats if they harass our ships at sea." Now, this is escalating tensions. It was not that long ago that U.S. naval ships in the Persian Gulf were swarmed by Iranian gunboats. This is a kind of natural escalation, I suppose. But the next and main story I have for you, it's actually really scary. The U.S. has sent warships into the disputed South China Sea. Now, I'm not a military analyst. I'm not going to necessarily tell you how China could or would respond to this, but there's a lot in this story. There's a lot going on, and I have said in a previous segment, we are on the brink of war with China because of something called Thucydides' trap. It basically states that as a rising power seeks to challenge a dominant power, war becomes inevitable. Now, it isn't inevitable, but according to some academics who wrote for The Atlantic, 12 out of 16 times over the past 500 years, when a rising power has challenged a dominant power, war has been the result. And now the U.S. has deployed warships into the South China Sea. China views this as their territory. I don't know how they will respond, but I can only surmise that at least to a certain degree, they will view this as an act of, well, let's call it trespass, to say the least. But sending military vessels into territory you claim as your own, I can only imagine, will lead to very dangerous escalation. And Australia is joining in. This is the next big update. Australia joins U.S. warship in South China Sea as tensions grow. Beijing angered its Southeast Asian neighbors by creating 2 administrative units on the disputed Parasil and Spratly Islands. Donald Trump ordering the destruction of Iranian vessels it's the most serious statement we've seen in a long time. If these Iranian vessels, which they've confirmed this has happened, take action and the U.S. shoots them and blows them up, I can only imagine things could essentially spark into something greater. Now, that story in and of itself is what it is, and I'll go over some of these details. But the powder keg is what I feel is most important. The U.S. vessels in the South China Sea. The Chinese strike group moving near Taiwan fears that China may move to strike Taiwan to seize it because there's a big dispute. Let me read these stories and we'll break things down. Before we get started, you can head over to timcast.com/donate if you'd like to support my work. There are many ways you can give, but the best thing you can do is share this video. YouTube claims that people like me are not authoritative. I find it laughable considering CNN is literally putting out fake reality TV nonsense that even the New York Times has called out. But if I'm going to compete with these algorithms and the front page advantage given to the mainstream media, then I need your help. You are more powerful than the algorithm, and if you choose to share this video, it's seriously, seriously powerful. Otherwise, just subscribe, hit the like button, and hit the notification bell to make sure you get more videos from me like this. Let's read the news from the New York Times. U.S. warships enter disputed waters of South China Sea as tensions with China escalate. The move comes as a war of words between the United States and China over the coronavirus pandemic intensifies. Now, there's a lot in here, and I'll tell you what, some of it is scarier than just this. American warships have sailed into disputed waters in the South China Sea, according to military analysts, heightening a standoff in the waterway and sharpening the rivalry between the United States and China, even as much of the world is in lockdown because of the coronavirus. The America, an amphibious assault ship, and the Bunker Hill, a guided missile cruiser, entered contested waters off Malaysia. At the same time, a Chinese government ship in the area has for days been tailing a Malaysian state oil company ship carrying out exploratory drilling. Chinese and Australian warships have also powered into nearby waters, according to the defense experts. Despite working to control a pandemic that spread from China earlier this year, Beijing has not reduced its activities in the South China Sea, a strategic waterway through which 1/3 of global shipping flows. Instead, the Chinese government's years-long pattern of assertiveness has only intensified, military analysts said. Quote, it's a quite deliberate Chinese strategy to try to maximize what they perceive as being a moment of distraction and the reduced capability of the United States to pressure neighbors, said Peter Jennings, a former Australian defense official who is the executive director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Since January, when the coronavirus epidemic began to surge, the Chinese government and Coast Guard ships, along with the maritime militias, have been plying contested waters in the South China Sea, tangling with regional maritime enforcement agencies and harassing fishermen. Earlier this month, the Vietnamese accused a Chinese patrol ship of ramming and sinking a Vietnamese fishing boat. Last month, China opened up 2 new research stations on artificial reefs. It has built on maritime turf claimed by the Philippines and others. The reefs are also equipped with defense silos and military-grade runways. Over the weekend, the Chinese government announced that it had formally established 2 new districts in the South China Sea that include dozens of contested islets and reefs. Many are submerged bits of atoll that do not confer territorial rights according to international law. Quote, "It seems that even as China was fighting a disease outbreak, it was also thinking in terms of its long-term strategic goals," said Alexander Vuving, a professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu. The Chinese want to create a new normal in the South China Sea, where they are in charge. And to do that, they've become more and more aggressive. So here we have an image, and I'll explain just what we can see, where just around, say, the Gulf of Tonkin, we've got Taiwan to the northeast, the Philippines to the east, Malaysia to the southeast, Malaysia to the southwest, and then we can see Vietnam in this to the west. I'm sorry, Malaysia to the southwest. So China is trying to claim this as their territory. We are moving in. They say after the sinking of the Vietnamese boat, the State Department urged China in a statement to remain focused on supporting international efforts to combat the global pandemic and to stop exploiting the distraction of vulnerability of other states to expand its unlawful claims in the South China Sea. The Chinese government has made vast claims to the South China Sea that conflict with demarcations made by 5 other governments. An international tribunal has dismissed most of China's claims to the waterway, but Beijing does not recognize the ruling and has instead built naval bases on reefs it now controls. While the U.S. has no territorial claims in the South China Sea, the American Navy says it has kept the peace in these waters for decades. American military officials have chastised China for its increased militarization of the waterway. Quote, "Through our continued operational presence in the South China Sea, we are working with our allies and partners to promote freedom of navigation and overflight and the international principles that underpin security and prosperity for the Indo-Pacific," said Lieutenant Commander Nicole Schwegman, a spokeswoman for the United States Indo-Pacific Command. The U.S. supports the efforts of our allies and partners to determine their own economic interests. The Chinese government has countered that the United States is the country destabilizing the region. The appearance of the American and the Bunker Hill may do little to dispel this narrative. Here we can see in this image the Chinese Navy during a military display in the South China Sea in 2018. And we've got what look like some kind of fighter jets, as well as a carrier and the rest of their strike group. They say, and regional governments have worried. The United States has a habit of briefly showing up in hotspots only to depart, leaving them to contend with an increasingly muscular Beijing. What is the intention of the U.S. here? Said Ian Story, a South China Sea expert at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, a think tank in Singapore. Is it just to say we're here, or are they going to shadow the Chinese survey ship to try and stop it from operating? The United States Indo-Pacific Command did not specify the exact location of the 2 American warships, citing operational restrictions, but it confirmed that the warships were in the South China Sea. On Tuesday, the United States Navy posted pictures on the warships on Twitter, accompanied by a 3rd vessel, a destroyer called the Berry, saying the Expeditionary Strike Group was operating in support of security and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, let me just add my hope that this is just going to be a military display. My concern, however, is that we have reports of Kim Jong Un potentially being incapacitated. That could absolutely destabilize the entire region, which could spark serious international conflict. But it goes beyond the South China Sea. We are seeing military conflict in numerous places, pitting the United States, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and China all into it's pitting them against, it's pitting them against us. The U.S. is being pitted against Russia, Iran, China, and Venezuela. In this story, we can see that Australia has joined the U.S. warships in South China as the tensions grow, which I showed you already. This story from Politico. Russians, Iranians hassle U.S. military in separate incidents. 11 Iranian vessels conducted dangerous and harassing approaches of U.S. warships in the international waters of the northern Persian Gulf on Wednesday. This is what Donald Trump was responding to. This was on April 15th. You may have heard me talk about it in several videos. If this escalates, and Donald Trump is serious and has instructed this, I don't know what the likelihood is that they strike, but it seems like war has never been closer. So, I've talked to some people. Many are concerned about the coronavirus. And as I mentioned in several videos as well, that people have said, Tim, man, you got to bug out. So when I hopped in the van, which you may notice I'm in the van, a lot of people have said, oh man, did Tim really bug out? No, I'm going on a road trip, going to the West Coast to do a show. But a lot of people are that concerned. It's not just about the coronavirus. What we are facing is a global, unprecedented disaster. And to say that we are sitting on the precipice is a bit of an understatement. I've said that several times. But we are hanging from it. Not only do we have this pandemic, which is rocking the economies of several nations and creating desperate times, we also have escalating military tensions and a famine brewing. Many of these countries are withholding resources, shutting down international trade, or closing their borders. And this could make things very, very dangerous. In this story from CNN, Russia intercepts U.S. Navy aircraft over the Mediterranean Sea. This story from just 2 days ago. A Russian fighter aircraft approached a U.S. Navy aircraft over the Mediterranean Sea Sunday. Both governments confirmed while offering different accounts of the incident. U.S. Naval Forces, Europe, Africa, U.S. 6th Fleet said in a statement Sunday, the Russian aircraft, an Su-35 jet, flew in an unsafe and unprofessional manner while intercepting the U.S. Navy P-8A Maritime Patrol and Reconnaissance aircraft. The U.S. Navy, it said, was the second time in 4 days that U.S. pilots made unsafe maneuvers while intercepting U.S. aircraft. The unnecessary actions of the Russian Su-35 pilot were inconsistent with good airmanship and international flight rules, seriously jeopardizing the safety of flight of both aircraft, the U.S. Navy said. While the Russian aircraft was operating in international airspace, the interaction was irresponsible. We expect them to behave within international standards set to ensure safety and to prevent incidents. Now, the concern here with the economy is that as I mentioned, people become more desperate, we are going to see more of this. Now, these may have happened in the past, and we don't focus on them because we're focused on other issues, internal issues, domestic issues, say the presidential election. But now we have to contend with a major global crisis. Many people are saying these protests to open up the economy are stupid, and these people are going to get us killed. In a segment I did for 1 p.m., which for those on the podcast will be coming up shortly, what I mentioned is that we are potentially looking at hundreds of millions of people starving to death. That means the death from the economic slowdown is going to dwarf. It's going to make the coronavirus look like nothing. And we need to make sure we balance. Now, if we reopen the economy to prevent this famine, it's very possible that we see more coronavirus death. And now for the next story. It's very possible that if we do not reopen this economy and strengthen our country and get our manufacturing back, we are facing international war we will not be prepared for. I think very few people want to see a war of this scale. And I say very few because there are some that love the profiteering. They know they'll make money from this. But there's another reason why the economy needs to be started up again. The U.S. just entered the South China Sea along with Australian aid. Will China take this as an act of U.S. trespass into their territory? They very well may. Now, I think China knows full well they don't actually own this territory, and they're trying to slowly assert that they do. They're expanding. They're putting military bases on these atolls, and if the U.S. does nothing, eventually it will be theirs. But we've sent this group in now. I don't know how that will play out, but there's so much more going on. Iranian Navy temporarily seizes vessels, sparking Persian Gulf alert. This is from the 14th. These are around the same stories we're seeing the U.S. coming in. These tensions are escalating, and there's more. Iran says its missiles can hit ships more than 400 miles away, has boats 3 times faster than the U.S. Navy. This from just the other day. They are prodding us. They know the COVID has weakened us. And as I mentioned, when this outbreak happened, if they want to go up against the United States, what better time than now? And the good news for the U.S., ain't nobody going to be invading our shores. Too many people in this country own guns. But it does mean that we will lose access to resources, and it will knock the U.S. down in a very dramatic way. It means that our military could be under fire. It means that a world war could happen. And if that war goes nuclear, it won't matter. Nothing will matter. the coronavirus won't matter. Famine won't matter because we'll be in post-apocalyptia. Now, we do have more news on Iran. Iran's guards say it launched its first military satellite into orbit, meaning they're expanding their military powers. We have the story. Donald Trump deployed U.S. anti-drug Navy ships near Venezuela. For those that haven't been following, this story happened, I believe, what's the date on this? April 1st. A Venezuelan ship tried to commandeer a vessel, opening fire on a German cruise liner. Now, the German cruise, I believe it was a civilian vessel, was a polar exploratory vessel. So, in a rather pathetic display, the Venezuelan ship rammed into it and then sank itself. But the Venezuelans, in their desperation, still opened fire and tried to see this vessel. We then saw shortly after that the U.S. was going to be deploying anti-drug Navy ships near Venezuela. It may be completely unrelated, but regardless, Venezuela is escalating tensions. The U.S. is sending warships. We are seeing flybys with the Russians. We are seeing potential tensions rising in the South China Sea. The powder keg is being filled. The fuse may be the coronavirus. And if that fuse, or the shutdown of the economy and the desperation caused by the coronavirus, if that fuse to the powder keg is the economy, our ties, and the coronavirus was the light that started it up, the fuse is now burning and the powder keg could go at any minute. There are many people protesting saying we got to stop it. Many people on the left say, no, let it burn because we don't want that fire on this side. Let it go. I don't know what to tell you, man. But I'll say this. North Korean leader Kim Jong Un recently had surgery, could be incapacitated, U.S. officials say. We don't know. There's conflicting reports. Some say maybe he's brain dead. He's 36. He's morbidly obese. He's a heavy smoker. And we're also facing a global pandemic. Well, a lot of people are talking about the fact that he received cardiovascular surgery. It's entirely possible, and I'm just making an assumption here, maybe he got the coronavirus. I mean, look, it started in China. North Korea borders China. It's entirely possible that the virus spread, he contracted it, and as someone who has these underlying conditions, he's been incapacitated by it. Perhaps what happened is that he's on a ventilator. I have no idea. But if Kim Jong Un goes, that's going to, I worry, destabilize the region. Let me slow down a second because I want to show you this next big story here about, it's from AM Greatness. China might try to take Taiwan. Now that would definitely be a spark lighting the powder keg. It's always important to point out that stories like these happen all the time. It's a fact. When we weren't so focused on this, when Trump wasn't tweeting about destroying Iranian vessels, these things were happening. And we saw, Iran was seizing oil tankers, potentially, putting sea mines out. We don't know for sure. Stories like this have been happening. And it could just be not that we're on the brink of war, but that we're hyper-focused on tensions that have always existed. The reality is we've always been in some kind of conflict with with our adversaries for food, for resources. One of the reasons they say why we have to occupy the Middle East is that, Iran and Russia and China would fill that vacuum if we weren't there. So the U.S. goes to do it. I'm not a big fan of that argument. I don't think the U.S. should be the world police, but there is fear within the U.S. government that if we're not, someone else will come in and they will do horrifying things to people. I'm not a big fan of how Vladimir Putin is basically the king of Russia, and we all know it. I'm not a big fan of the Communist Party of China. The United States is far from perfect, but it's certainly better than basically every country on the planet. I think, what is the saying? Democracy, it's something like democracy is the worst, is a horrible form of government, but it's the best we've ever had, or something like that. It's the best form of the worst government, whatever. The point is, we got a lot of problems with how our country functions. We got a lot of problems with crony capitalism and corruption, but it's not nearly as bad as it is in many of these countries. This story from AM Greatness. China might try to take Taiwan. Not since the interwar period has the American military position in the Pacific been weaker, and the Chinese know it. And now with the Theodore Roosevelt having most of its troops evacuated due to the coronavirus, they know we've been put in a very, very weak position. And they know they can take it. Here's what they write. Even though it was the source of the novel coronavirus pandemic, China appears to be the only country benefiting geopolitically from this from its knock-on effects. China's number one strategic goal has been to reclaim Taiwan, an island it has long considered merely to be a breakaway province. It seems poised to accomplish this task. Many analysts, such as Ian Easton of Project 2049, have argued that China would try to reclaim Taiwan at some point in the next decade. Yet reality often presents opportunities, and the pandemic is the strategic opportunity of a lifetime. The warning indicators are flashing, or they should be in Washington. Not only has the Chinese People's Liberation Army Force, the PLAAF, Air Force, been conducting ongoing aggressive flights into Taiwanese airspace, but last Thursday, the PLAAF performed a detailed reconnaissance mission over southern Taiwan. Then, on Saturday evening, China's only aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, sailed from China through the Japanese-controlled Strait of Miyako, escorted by 2 guided missile destroyers and 2 additional guided missile frigates. That move prompted Taiwan to scramble its navy. The Liaoning and its escort sailed beyond Okinawa, turned south, and kept going, its ultimate destination unknown to all except Beijing. Of course, we can guess where the carrier is headed. In all likelihood, the carrier is sailing south of Taiwan. It is following a pattern that the Chinese military employed last year during what was, at the time, China's largest war game since the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis. Most of those who are paying attention to China's military movements both around Taiwan and in the South China Sea believe that China is merely flexing its muscles, albeit in a big way. In response, the Trump administration ordered a display of force. The B-52 bombers assigned to the U.S. military base in Guam, roughly 1,800 miles away from China, conducted an elephant walk, wherein the bombers are lined up on the runway ready to fly. The implications of this move are clear. Should China try any funny business with Taiwan, there is no guarantee that Washington will sit on its hands. Of course, after this show of force, the Trump administration ordered all B-52s out of Guam with no replacements being flown in. It is likely that this is because China has a missile they call the Guam Killer that could potentially destroy the entire B-52's force on the island should war erupt. Clearly, there are concerns about China's growing hostilities since the COVID-19 pandemic spread from China. The Trump administration is merely replicating the pattern the Clinton administration began in 1996. At that time, Taiwan citizens were set to vote in their presidential elections, and a pro-independence candidate was likely to win. In order to prevent a pro-independence leader from gaining traction in a place like Beijing, in a place Beijing views as a rebellious province waiting to be reclaimed, China's military was deployed to intimidate the Taiwanese people. Salvos of missiles rocketed over the besieged island routinely, and the Chinese military conducted mock invasion drills of Taiwan. It all ended when the Clinton administration sailed 2 U.S. Navy supercarriers through the Strait of Taiwan, signaling America's intention to intervene militarily to protect Taiwanese sovereignty. That move stopped the crisis from spilling over into armed conflict. Taiwan's election proceeded unhindered by China. China took a key lesson from that episode to heart. To reclaim Taiwan, it needed to divorce the American military from its defense of Taiwan. In 1996, 2 supercarriers operating miles away from China's exposed coastline were more than enough to get Beijing to back down. Today, this is not the case. The Trump administration's decision to elephant walk B-52s on the tarmac in Guam is an admirable attempt to deter Chinese aggression against Taiwan. Ultimately, however, it will prove insufficient. It also highlights American weakness in the Pacific. Chinese leaders likely wonder why there were no aircraft carriers available. Oh, wait, that's right. America's 2 supercarriers assigned to the Pacific, the USS Ronald Reagan and the USS Theodore Roosevelt, are both out of commission because of COVID-19 outbreaks on board. Chillingly, China's carrier, the Liaoning, is now the only operational aircraft carrier in the Indo-Pacific at this time. Not since the interwar period has the American military position in the Pacific been weaker, and the Chinese know it. Now I'll point out, the Chinese military is relatively weak. They have 1 aircraft carrier. It's nothing compared to what we have. But we're disabled by a virus right now, and that's scary. I don't know if this will lead to war, but I do feel like we are closer than we've ever been. Let me remind you, Donald Trump just ordered, at least he claims he did on Twitter, the U.S. Navy to destroy Iranian gunboats. Warships have just entered the South China Sea. That may not be enough to deter China's moves right now. It seems like China is waiting for an opportunity to seize Taiwan. Should the U.S. be the world police and intervene? I don't know. If Kim Jong Un is sick and goes, maybe that powder keg goes up, and then we've got a conflict in Korea. We've got a crisis in the entire Southeast Asian region. I guess only time will tell. Next segment will be coming up at youtube.com/TimCastNews, 6 p.m. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all then.